Well, this is definitely not how I start most of my woodworking projects. With a lot of steel. See, a few months ago I was asked to make a set of garden gates, and when I actually went to look out at them, it turned out they were a little bigger than I had expected. And by that, of course, I mean they were absolutely enormous. And that was just the start of the problems. Now, going into this, I did know that I was only going to have a single pillar per gate. So I was going to have to make a post to have the other sides hang off of. What I did not know, however, was that there was an underground stream directly below where I wanted to put both posts, which of course meant I couldn't bury the ends as deep as I would like, or they would have ended up as semi-aquatic posts, shall we say, which would have been quite bad. So my idea for how to get around this anyway was to make a wooden sheath or cover that would wrap around a central steel column, at the base of which you might have noticed earlier I welded on an X-shaped foot. And once that whole structure was bedded in concrete, it should have been more than strong enough to support the gate. So in the last couple of shots, you saw me struggling to cut up and break down some large 6x3 material. See, I wanted to make the post out of something really substantial, like a 6x6, but I had no real good way of getting sections that big. So what I decided to do was go to a local sawyer, or someone who cuts up trees, basically. And he had this nice old growth Douglas fir knocking about, so I got him to cut two 6x6s for me, and then split those down the middle to get my 6x3 material ready. And what you see me do so far is basically just cut out the middle where the 4-inch galvanized box section is going to go. Now in this shot, the steel is only in there temporarily, but you start to get an idea of what I was trying to achieve with the timber wrapped around the steel section. And here I am actually gluing it in with, well, I can't exactly remember what it was, but basically just some super strong all-weather adhesive glue stuff. Now, it did need some friendly persuasion with the hammer to sit down fully, but once it was in there, I made sure to get a really good coating of the glue on all four sides before just dropping in the final piece, as you see here. And while that glue was meant to be the best, most revolutionary stuff ever, I guess I'm just naturally mistrustful, so I still felt the need to add a few screws for reinforcements. And once everything had set up, I was able to take off practically all the clamps I owned. And here you just see me adding some plugs to each of those screw holes I drilled earlier. Now I made sure to leave the steel down from the top a little bit, and while this won't affect the strength of it at all, it did allow me to add these wooden caps to seal off the ends of the posts. Got a nice snug fit on those, as you can see. Once the glue had set on those, I could cut a slight angle on each of the sides just for the look of the thing, really. Here you can see me adding a small round over to the corner, just to soften the edges and make it look a little bit more refined. And a little bit of sanding. The posts were finally done. I installed them off camera before starting on the gates proper. And here you can see me highlighting my super sophisticated dust management system. Now, finally, I can actually start on the gate part of the gate project. And I started by cutting down all the stock that goes into making up the frame. This piece of plywood you see me cutting is actually going to become the jig that I use to route out all the mortises in the project. And I'm just using a super long router bit to cut these out. Now, the router does leave rounded edges to the mortises that have to be squared up with a chisel, as you see me doing here, but that only takes a minute or two for each mortise. Now, when I was making this video, I had just gotten this router, and I'd never actually owned one before. I'd used them plenty with work, etc. Never actually owned one. So I guess the novelty value was quite strong, as I decided to cut the tenons with the router as well. So that piece of wood you saw me clamp on was to mark the shoulder locations, and that extra bit I just cut off was to keep the router level. And then I could just cut the other shoulders with my handsaw, as honestly it seemed the easiest way to do it, rather than setting up another machine. Now this was the part of the project I had to get really quite creative, just to solve a really simple problem, in that these gates were massive, and I had no clamps anywhere near long enough to tighten the joints properly. So I decided to try a technique called draw boring. Now, draw boring is an extremely traditional method for tightening up joints, whereby dowels, which you just saw me make, are hammered into offset holes that go through both the mortise and the tenon. And because those holes are offset, the joint is really squeezed shut when those dowels are hammered in. You'll see what I mean in a second. Here I have the mortise holes already drilled, and I'm using the same bit to mark the hole locations on the tenons. And you can see I just stepped the bit back towards the shoulder to create that offset. A couple of millimeters is really all you need. Here you can see what I was talking about earlier, with the dowels hitting on the bottom of the hole first. Now, the keen-eyed observer may have noticed I put 3 dowels per joint, and that possibly may have been overkill in that single one, maybe 2, would have been more than enough. As you can see, the glue squeezing out all along the joint here really just goes to show you how effective this method is. And once the glue had gone off, I could just take my saw and cut off the excess dowel. The next step was to make the diagonal brace that goes from corner to corner inside the gate frame. So all I did was clamp it in place and use my knife to scribe it to its exact location. And I could just cut that off with my handsaw. I clamped a block of wood next to my line so that I could make sure my cut was straight and plumb. And maybe I was getting a little lazy here, but I basically decided to pocket screw it in from the back. I mean, they're never going to be seen, and I figured 5 screws each end would be more than strong enough. Not to mention the fact that it'll be held in place by however many screws from the actual sheeting boards themselves. And you can see how neatly that turned out. It should turn out quite nicely with a little bit of sanding. Now that I have the whole frame assembled, I could move on to marking the curve for the sheeting board template. To do this, I used the string method to draw a perfect ellipse for the curve. And as you can see here, the string just acts as a guide for my pencil, really. So I was using this thin door skin ply to make the template, and it was a little bit light, so I decided to sandwich 2 layers together with some spray adhesive and of course, everyone knows the best way to get spray glue to stick. And now I could cut out the curve I just marked, and because it was such a gentle curve, I could literally just bend my saw to cut it, and surprisingly that actually worked. I could then start working on the cladding that would go on the outside of the gates. So I picked up this pressure treated shiplap siding, and I went for this. Well, firstly I didn't want to go to all the effort of making my own, but also I knew that these overlapped each other enough that I could trim each one a little bit to fit in the gate frame. You'll see what I mean here in just a second. Here you can see it's about 100 millimeters too wide, but I knew I could trim a small bit off each end to get them to fit perfectly into the gate frame. And this is where my template comes in handy. I can lay it down and use it to mark exactly where the curve is before coming into my jigsaw to remove 90% of the waste. And I just made sure to keep well away from my lines, and this is just to make it a little easier on my router later on. And then I can mark out and pre-drill each one of the screw holes on the sheeting board. And each board gets 6 screws, so it is very secure, though it does make for a lot of drilling. I made sure to leave a mil or two of a gap between each board to allow for seasonal wood movement, as if I didn't, the boards could swell and burst the frame basically otherwise. So as I put the screws in each board, I was constantly checking to make sure the gap was even all the way around. And I didn't add any glue, as this could also affect seasonal wood movement. And then, yeah, maybe 100, 150 plugs. Each one needed to be glued, knocked in, chiseled off, and sanded. And this is where the template really shines, as I was able to clamp it down and just use a flush trim bit in my router to make sure the curve was absolutely perfect. And this worked really well and left a nice finish. This is really for my own peace of mind and definitely not strictly necessary, but I added a 100mm screw to each joint, just as a bit of added security. Now I went over the whole surface with a smoothing plane just to save myself some time sanding later on, before I used a chamfer bit in my router on the inside of the frame just to knock off the sharp edges. Any small defects got a mixture of sawdust and glue before I just came in and sanded the whole surface, which took a while. Now, unfortunately I didn't get any video of me installing the gates, just because it was at someone else's house, but I also installed these horizontal wooden runners you can see between the pillars. Everything has gotten a few coats of this brown wood stain, and I also installed these ring pull handles as well, just for ease of access. And here you can see it just latches on the back side, and the whole thing is secured in place with these drop bolts, one per gate, and the same obviously on the other side. Well, I know this was a real long one, so for anyone that actually made it this far, thanks for sticking it out. This is by far and away the biggest physical project I've ever attempted, and well, definitely isn't perfect, I was frankly surprised with how it turned out in the end. Hope you at least learned something, and again, thanks for watching.